We've already divided everything, my aunt announced confidently. You weren't invited here for a reason. The room buzzed with quiet agreement as if the decision had already been made. Then the lawyer looked down at the papers in front of him and frowned. He cleared his throat and said, "Actually, her name is the only one listed in the will." In that moment, the entire room fell into a heavy, stunned silence. The silence in the room was heavier than a tombstone, a suffocating weight that seemed to press the very air out of my lungs. I stood there, trembling not from fear, but from the sudden, sharp realization that the people I once called family had been planning to erase me from existence. When I walked through those heavy mahogany doors, I knew the air would be thick with judgment, but I never expected the absolute, chilling precision with which they intended to exclude me from my own grandmother's final chapter. My name is Amanda Miller, and at 28, I never expected to become the reluctant protagonist of a twisted family war. The memory of my grandmother, Eleanor, is still fresh, a bittersweet ache that reminds me of Sunday afternoons in her historic Boston home, a place where the scent of old books and baking spice cookies felt like safety. Last month, when she passed after that long, weary battle with illness, I thought the grief would be the hardest part. I was wrong. The hardest part was discovering, through a clumsy, accidental text from my cousin, that the people who shared my blood had been quietly orchestrating my disappearance from the one event that mattered, the reading of her will. Despite the churning knot of anxiety in my stomach, I chose to show up. I walked into that lawyer's office with my head held high, only to be met by my Aunt Judith's cold, triumphant smirk. "We already divided everything," she had hissed, her voice dripping with practiced condescension. "You weren't invited for a reason, Amanda. It's over." But then the lawyer, a man who looked entirely too bewildered for such a polite profession, adjusted his glasses and peered down at the document. "But her name," he stammered, his eyes flickering from Judith's icy glare to my own, "is the only one in the will." Growing up, my life was a study in contrasts. I was the daughter of Robert, Grandma Eleanor's youngest son, the black sheep who had dared to trade the cold, calculated world of high-stakes investment for the humble, vital life of a high school teacher. My mother, Samantha, was a nurse whose hands were as steady as her heart was kind. They didn't leave me with a trust fund or a portfolio, but they gave me something far more durable, the unshakable understanding that a person's worth is measured by how they treat those who can do nothing for them. Every Sunday was a pilgrimage to Grandma Eleanor's grand Victorian house. It was a relic of a different time, a sanctuary where the floorboards creaked with history and the garden whispered stories of the women who had tended it before me. When I was 12, the world fractured. My father died suddenly, a silent, swift aneurysm that tore him away before I could even say goodbye. The financial and emotional fallout was devastating, and in the shadow of that sudden void, it was Grandma Eleanor who stepped into the breach. She didn't offer pity, she offered presence. "Amanda will live with me part of the week," she had declared to a family that was already eyeing the horizon, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. Those 6 years were the forge of my character. I split my existence between my mother's modest apartment and the grandeur of the Victorian house, where Grandma became my second parent. We would sit in that overgrown garden, the summer heat pressing down on us, and she would look at me with those piercing, knowing eyes. "You're like me, Amanda," she would murmur, tracing the veins on a leaf. "You see people for who they are, not what they can give you." She wasn't like the rest of them. She wore simple wools, she slipped envelopes of cash into the hands of the needy, and she treated her home not as a trophy of wealth, but as a vessel for the memories of a life well lived. My Uncle Philip and Aunt Judith, however, lived in a different universe. They resided in sprawling, sterile mansions in the suburbs, surrounded by the kind of luxury that feels designed to impress rather than provide comfort. They viewed Grandma's lack of pretense as a failure, a stain on the family name that needed to be scrubbed clean. When I entered nursing, specializing in the quiet, profound work of hospice care, the disconnect turned into active disdain. I remember being 21 at a Thanksgiving dinner, the table groaning under the weight of silver and excess. Uncle Philip had cornered me by the sideboard, his glass of expensive bourbon catching the dining room light. "You could work for the family firm, Amanda," he said, his voice a smooth, patronizing purr as he looked down his nose at me. "Why waste your time on a career with such a pathetic ceiling? Your grandmother could make one phone call, and you'd never have to work a day in your life." I just smiled, a small, tight thing that didn't reach my eyes. I want to earn my own way, Uncle Philip, I replied. His cousins, Rachel and Nathan, were the products of the same mold, prestige, pedigree, and a terrifyingly shallow understanding of success. To them, the world was a ledger of debits and credits, and they couldn't fathom why I wouldn't want to be rich. They saw me as a mystery, perhaps even a threat to their future bottom line. As the years marched on and Grandma entered her 80s, the inevitable decline began. I became a fixture at the Victorian house, not out of duty, but out of a deep, tethered love. I brought groceries, navigated the bewildering landscape of her medications, and sat with her through the long afternoons. We baked those legendary spice cookies, the secret of which, a sharp, surprising dash of black pepper, remained our little tether to sanity in a family that seemed to be losing its own. "You've got flour on your nose again," she'd chuckle, her voice growing thinner with every passing season. Even as her body retreated, her wit remained sharp enough to cut glass. She told me of her own grandmother, a pioneer who was one of the first female doctors in the state, and of the family fortune, which had been built on grit, mechanical innovation, and the kind of hard-won success that modern money could never replicate. "Wealth doesn't make a person worthy," she told me during one of those quiet, waning afternoons. "How they treat others when they think there's nothing to gain, that's the only measure that matters." The rest of the family treated these visits like chores. Philip would stop by for 10 minutes, his eyes constantly scanning the house for potential renovations or valuation upgrades, never once looking at his mother with anything resembling warmth. Judith brought gifts that were flashy and useless, crystal vases and designer shawls, and left the moment her hour was up. They were waiting for an ending, while I was simply trying to honor the life that was still being lived. That December, she gave me the small wooden box. Inside, resting on frayed velvet, was a simple, modest pearl necklace. "I want you to have this now," she said, her voice heavy with a significance I wouldn't grasp until much later. "The others would just see pearls, Amanda. But you'll understand that their value comes from who wore them." I had no idea then that this small, sentimental gesture was planting the seeds of the firestorm to come. The first real crack in the foundation appeared 3 years ago, when Grandma was 85. Philip called a meeting at the house, ostensibly for care planning, but the presence of a real estate agent in the living room told a much darker story. They wanted the lake house, the one sanctuary Grandma had cherished since she was a child. "It's sitting empty, and the maintenance is ridiculous," Philip announced, his tone clinical. I looked at Grandma, her face a mask of practiced neutrality, though I knew the subtle tension in her jaw. When I stood up for her, when I reminded them that the lake house was her joy, not their asset, the room turned on me. I became the enemy, the manipulator, the girl who was supposedly poisoning her mind against her own flesh and blood. From that moment on, I was the target of a quiet, relentless campaign to erode my influence and isolate her from the only person who cared for her soul. They didn't want the estate to be handled with love. They wanted it liquidated, packaged, and distributed before the ink on her death certificate was even dry. And they were going to do whatever it took to make sure I wasn't there to watch them take it. The silence that followed the final note of my grandmother's voice in that conference room was not the thick, suffocating dread of the will reading, but a cold, crystalline clarity that felt like justice finally finding its footing. The screen, now dark, still held the ghost of her presence, the sharp, piercing intelligence of her eyes, the unflinching steady tone of her voice, and as I looked around the table, the veneer of my family's indignation began to peel away, revealing the terrified, opportunistic strangers underneath. Uncle Philip, a man who had spent his entire life building an empire of status and influence, looked suddenly diminished, his shoulders slumped as if the air had been physically drained from his lungs. Aunt Judith was no longer the poised matron of the social circle. She was just a woman caught in the act, her hand pressed to her lips, her eyes darting toward the exit, as if she could simply walk away from the reality of her own greed. Rachel and Nathan sat in a paralysis of shock, their sophisticated, expensive armor rendered useless by the simple, unvarnished truth of their own behavior, as documented by the woman they had all assumed was too frail to notice. Sarah Donovan, my litigation attorney, sat with a calm, predatory grace, her hands folded neatly on the mahogany table as she waited for the gravity of the moment to settle. She didn't need to say a word. She had laid out a map of their moral bankruptcy, and they were all currently lost in it. The air in the room was electric, vibrating with the kind of tension that comes right before a structural collapse. Uncle Philip's attorney, the man who had arrived so confident in his boilerplate legal arguments, was suddenly shuffling his papers. His eyes fixed on his briefcase, as if he were trying to calculate a way to bill for hours that were now decidedly less productive. It was the moment I had dreamt of, yet it wasn't the cathartic scream I had imagined. It was something much quieter, a cold, clinical realization that the myth of my family's superiority had been shattered by the one person who knew the truth better than anyone. I thought back to the nights in my apartment, staring at the walls, the crushing weight of the accusations, the invasive phone calls, the way they had tried to turn my professional reputation into a weapon against me. I remembered the nights I had wept into my pillow, wondering if the inheritance was worth the loss of my peace, if the house and the history were worth the price of my own soul. But as I watched their faces contort with the dawning realization that their gambit had failed, that they hadn't just lost the money, but had been exposed as the architects of their own downfall, I realized that Grandma hadn't just given me an estate. She had given me the truth, and the truth was the only thing that could set me free. She had spent the last 2 years of her life living in a state of quiet, tactical vigilance, turning her own home into a courtroom of sorts, documenting every betrayal, every petty theft, every moment of performative affection that was actually a transaction in disguise. She had played the long game, not because she was bitter, but because she was protective, and in doing so, she had ensured that I would never be the victim of their revisionist history. "Mr. Carter," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. She addressed Philip not as a grieving relative, but as a defendant. "The evidence you see before you is only the beginning. We have invoices, travel logs, financial audit trails, and the testimonies of the hospice staff who witnessed firsthand exactly who was there for Eleanor and who was merely waiting for her to expire. We are prepared to enter all of this into the public record. Unless this matter is settled today, in accordance with the will's explicit instructions." Philip finally found his voice, though it sounded like grinding stone. "This is blackmail," he spat, though it lacked the conviction of a man who actually believed he was in the right. "This is not blackmail," I said, finally speaking up, my voice steady, ringing clear against the mahogany. "This is the consequence of your choices, Uncle Philip. This is what happens when you treat family like a business strategy. Grandma saw everything. She saw you looking at her house like a real estate investment, and she saw Judith looking at her life like a clearance sale. She saw it all, and she made a decision. She didn't make it because she was manipulated. She made it because she was the only one in this room who still knew what love actually looked like." The shift in the room was seismic. The threat of public exposure, the scandal of it, the way it would strip away the final layers of their manufactured reputation, was clearly the only language they understood. They weren't afraid of being wrong, they were terrified of being seen. We spent the next 3 hours in a grueling, meticulous negotiation, every single item from the inventory accounted for, every missing piece of jewelry, every stolen artifact, every dollar they had siphoned away under the guise of care, clawed back through the threat of litigation. I didn't care about the money, and I didn't care about the prestige, but I cared about the principle. I cared that they wouldn't get away with the erasure of her life. By the time we left, the agreements were signed, the timelines for the return of the stolen goods were set in stone, and the lawsuit contesting the will had been officially withdrawn, dissolved by the sheer weight of the evidence we held. As I walked out of the law office and into the cool, crisp Boston air, I felt as though I had shed a skin. The legal nightmare was winding down, but the emotional work was just beginning. I returned to the Victorian house that evening, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a collection of ghosts. It felt like a foundation. I walked through the halls, touching the places where the items had been missing, knowing that they would soon be returned, restored to the rooms where they belonged. The house was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence now. I went to the kitchen and took out the jar of black pepper, the one thing that had been our secret, the one ingredient that made the world a little more bearable. I started to bake, the familiar motions of sifting flour and measuring spices grounding me, bringing back the memory of her laugh, the way she would look at me with those eyes that saw through everything. I realized then that the war I had been dragged into wasn't a tragedy, it was a test of character that I had survived. I had lost the family I thought I had, but I had gained a deeper understanding of the family I had actually inherited, one rooted in integrity, grit, and the refusal to be bought. The calls had stopped, the social media attacks had faded into the background noise of other people's dramas, and I was finally able to breathe again. I was the keeper of her legacy now, the guardian of the history she had fought so hard to protect. And as the scent of spice cookies filled the air, I sat in her chair by the window, looked out over the garden that was beginning to wake up with the spring, and finally understood the true weight of the gift she had left me. It wasn't the house, the money, or the status. It was the freedom to be exactly who she had raised me to be, a person who knew that while money could buy a house, it could never, ever buy a home. And the people who had tried to build their lives on the hollow foundation of greed would always, eventually, find themselves standing on nothing at all. I began to look toward the future, a future where I didn't have to apologize for my choices, where I didn't have to seek their approval, and where the only opinions that mattered were the ones she had whispered to me. In the quiet, golden hours of our afternoons together, my life as a hospice nurse was calling me back, and I felt ready, stronger than I had ever been, to walk back into the lives of others, knowing that I had successfully navigated the most difficult patient of all, my own grief and the vultures who had tried to capitalize on it. I sat there in the fading light, the silence no longer a void, but a promise of everything that was yet to come. The finality of the court's decision didn't come with a celebration, but with a profound, quiet exhale that seemed to travel through the very bones of the house. For months, the air here had been heavy with the residue of legal filings, threats, and the cold, sharp edges of betrayal, but as I stood in Grandma Eleanor's garden, watching the bees navigate the lavender she had planted years ago, the house finally felt like it belonged to itself again. I had spent my leave of absence from the hospice center turning this space into a sanctuary once more, layering my own life over the history she had left behind, adding bookshelves to the study, a small, sun-drenched meditation corner in the sunroom, and wind chimes that sang softly whenever the coastal breeze caught them. The inheritance had given me the financial freedom I never dreamed of, but it had also placed a heavy mantle of responsibility on my shoulders, a weight I was only just beginning to learn how to carry with grace. It was on a rain-streaked afternoon, while I was meticulously clearing out her desk, that I found the envelope. It had been tucked away in the back of a drawer, hidden behind a stack of old property tax records. It was addressed simply to me, for Amanda, after everything is settled. I sat in her high-backed leather chair, the rain tapping rhythmically against the window pane, and broke the seal. Inside, her familiar, elegant handwriting seemed to reach out to me from the page. She told me that the inheritance was never a weapon meant to punish the others, even though that was how they had perceived it. It was, instead, a recognition of the heart she had seen in me, a heart that mirrored the quiet, steady integrity of my father, Robert. She warned me that money is a strange, distorting lens that reveals the true shape of people, often bringing out a jagged, hollow selfishness that she had spent her life watching with a mixture of sadness and skepticism. She had chosen me, she wrote, because I was the only one who didn't view her as a ledger or an obstacle. When I made mistakes, I owned them. When I disagreed with her, I did so with respect. When I helped, I did it with no expectation of reward. Her final advice was simple yet profound. Don't let this wealth alter the architecture of my soul. Use the security to foster generosity. Take the trip to Italy we had whispered about for years, and fund the programs that could change lives. She encouraged me to set firm boundaries, as she had done, but to leave a narrow, deliberate door open for growth and eventual reconciliation. The grief, which had been a jagged, constant companion, began to soften into something more like a quiet, persistent love. I began the work she had outlined. I established the Eleanor Miller Memorial Scholarship at my old nursing school, creating a lifeline for students dedicated to the delicate, vital work of hospice and palliative care. I drafted the initial documents for a foundation designed to advocate for the elderly, ensuring that those who didn't have a granddaughter to fight for them would never be silenced or ignored. When I finally took that trip to the small Tuscan village where her parents were born, I didn't feel like a tourist. I felt like a bridge. Walking those ancient, sun-warmed cobblestones, I felt the lineage of my own history, a connection that far outlasted the petty, exhausting drama of a contested will. Healing in the family, however, was a slower, more delicate process, like tending to a garden after a harsh winter. Cousin Rachel was the first to reach out, asking for coffee. She brought photos of her newborn daughter, named Eleanor, and for the first time, we spoke not as opponents, but as women. She wanted her child to know the real stories, the human stories, and I was happy to share them. Nathan invited me to his wedding, and while the atmosphere was formal and strained, the simple act of him introducing me to his new world as the head of the foundation felt like a long overdue acknowledgement of my existence. Aunt Judith remained a distant, ghostly figure, but a brief, handwritten note on a Christmas card, acknowledging that Grandma would have been proud of my work, felt like the closest thing to an apology I was ever going to get. Uncle Philip, however, stayed behind the wall he had built of pride and rigid status. I learned to accept his absence, holding no malice, but refusing to lower my boundaries to accommodate his ego. The most unexpected grace arrived in the form of Lucas, a distant cousin from the West Coast who remembered my father with a warmth that moved me to tears. Through him, I found a wider, untainted branch of the family, people who didn't care about the estate or the scandal, but were eager to share old photographs and stories of the people I had lost. A year after her passing, I hosted a memorial dinner in the garden. It wasn't a gathering of the high society family members who had once dominated these grounds, but a mix of caregivers, loyal friends, Lucas's family, and the few relatives who had demonstrated genuine care. As the evening progressed, Mr. Harrison, her old lawyer, joined me on the porch. He looked out at the guests, a small, satisfied smile playing on his lips. He told me that in all his decades of practice, he had seen families dismantled by far less, and he was struck by the fact that I had remained entirely myself throughout the storm. He shared a final secret. Eleanor had told him that her greatest achievement wasn't her fortune, but the fact that she had helped raise a daughter who understood that integrity was the only currency that truly mattered in the end. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn, I felt the peace of a debt paid in full. I had lost the family I thought I knew, but I had gained a chosen family bound by respect and the memory of the woman who had trusted me with her life's work. I walked to the mantel and looked at her photograph. Her expression hadn't changed, but the way I saw it had. She wasn't just a figure of the past, she was a compass. I understood then that her true bequest wasn't the Victorian house, the financial accounts, or the heirlooms that were now back in their rightful places. It was the absolute, unshakable courage to live by my own values, even when the world or my own kin demanded that I be something else. As the last of the guests trickled out into the night and the fireflies began to dance against the backdrop of the deepening twilight, I stood on the porch, a quiet smile on my face. The war was over, the wreckage had been cleared, and the future, once a source of terror, now felt like an open road. I looked up at the first stars, whispering a final, gentle thank you into the cool night air. "We did it, Grandma," I said, my voice steady and clear. "We set things right." And in the silence that followed, I knew that wherever she was watching, and she was proud. Life, I realized, is not about the hand we are dealt, or even the family we are born into. It is about the conviction with which we play our part, and the refusal to let anyone else dictate the measure of our worth. I took a deep breath, the scent of lavender and evening dampness filling my lungs, and finally walked inside to start the next chapter of a life that was, for the first time, entirely, beautifully, and authentically my own. If you have ever felt the need to claim your own voice when the voices around you are trying to drown it out, or if you have ever had to build something beautiful from the pieces of a broken relationship, know that you are not alone. Sometimes the most significant inheritance is not what is written in a will, but the strength we discover when we are forced to stand for what we know is true. Thank you for walking this path with me, and I hope, whatever struggles you are facing, that you always find the courage to hold on to your truth, just as she taught me to hold on to mine.